A few years back, I spent 2 weeks driving solo through the Blue Ridge and Smoky Mountains, taking time off after a rough breakup and a job I'd stayed in too long. I didn't have a clear plan, just a cooler of food, my tent, and a worn-out trail map of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I'd always loved hiking, and I figured the isolation would help clear my head. I wasn't expecting peace exactly, but I wanted stillness. I got something else. By the end of the first week, I'd already camped at several sites along the North Carolina side, mostly near popular trails. Crowds were thin. It was mid-October, just after the fall foliage rush, and the nights had started to dip below freezing. Most of the other hikers I ran into were older couples or Appalachian Trail through hikers. Pushing south before winter, I set my sights on a more remote section of the park just west of Clingman's Dome, off one of the lesser-known trailheads that branched off from the Forney Ridge area. I parked at a gravel turnout around noon and packed lightly. Just a tent, sleeping bag, food for one night, and my water filter. I figured I'd hike a few miles in, set up camp near the creek I'd seen marked on the map, and hike back out the next morning. It was supposed to be simple. The trail itself was narrow and overgrown in places, definitely not well maintained. Every so often, I had to stop and push branches out of the way or climb over fallen trees. I passed no one, not a single soul. It was quiet, almost unnaturally, so I didn't think much of it at the time. I welcomed the silence. Around 3:30 p.m., I reached a clearing beside the creek. The trees formed a tight canopy overhead, and the water ran smooth over mossy rocks. It was exactly what I'd been hoping for: isolated, shaded, peaceful. I set up my tent in the middle of the clearing, took off my boots, and soaked my feet in the cold creek for a while. The sun dipped behind the hills earlier than I expected, and shadows stretched long and deep. I boiled some water for noodles, ate in silence, and listened to the wind pushing through the trees. Still, no other hikers, no animals, not even bird song. When it got dark, it got dark. My headlamp barely punched through the blackness outside the tent. I stayed awake reading for a while, then zipped myself into the sleeping bag and tried to drift off. I'd camped more times than I could count. I was no stranger to nights alone in the woods. In fact, that trip alone, it was already my 3rd or 4th night sleeping in the tent. The occasional crack of a branch or rustling in the brush didn't bother me. Out here, those sounds were a good sign. The forest goes quiet when something's really wrong. Silence, that's what gets under your skin. That night, the usual sounds were back. Crickets, small animals moving in the undergrowth. I actually found it comforting, but still, I couldn't fall asleep. I'd been tossing around for what felt like hours. Something just wasn't letting me settle. I didn't feel scared. It was more like a pressure in my chest, like my body knew something I didn't. Eventually, I gave up trying to force it. I flicked the headlamp back on and grabbed my book, thinking maybe if I read a few pages, I'd doze off. But midnight came and went. I was tired, bone-tired, but wired at the same time. Like some old instinct wouldn't let me shut down. Then I heard a cough. Not an animal sound, not the forest shifting or the wind moving through the trees. It was human somewhere near the trail, maybe 20 or 30 yards off. I froze, the book dropped into my lap, and I just sat there listening. But as the seconds went by, everything stayed silent. I didn't even think. I unzipped the sleeping bag and reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly opened the tent flap. That's when I saw her sitting right at the edge of the creek, maybe 10, 15 feet away. I couldn't see her face. She was turned away from me. But from the long hair, the shape of her shoulders, I was sure it was a woman. She was completely still. I think what scared me the most was that even just seeing her hair and part of her back, the woman looked completely lost. Her hair was loose, tangled, and the dress she was wearing was torn on the right side. I wanted to say something, ask if she was okay, but my voice just wouldn't come out. I was shining a light right at her. Any normal person would have looked back, would have reacted, but she didn't move. I managed to snap out of it after a few seconds and quickly scanned the woods around her, then the area around my tent, but there was nothing. No movement, no one else. So I turned the light back to the creek, and she was gone. Just gone. I started sweeping the beam everywhere, left, right, behind trees, even up into the branches. But there was no sign of her. Not a sound, not a footstep. Absolutely nothing. And that made it worse. Seeing her was one thing. Not seeing her anymore. That was way more terrifying. I stepped out of the tent barefoot and moved toward the creek. The flashlight was shaking in my hand, and the only thing I could think of was her suddenly rushing me from the dark. The image made me physically sick. When I got to where she'd been, I saw something that stopped me cold. Footprints, bare ones, pressed into the damp earth near the edge of the water. She'd been there. There was no doubt. But where the hell had she gone? I packed up my tent as fast as I could and got back on the trail. I spent the rest of the night constantly looking over my shoulder. The only thing running through my head was the image of that woman, suddenly charging out of the trees, completely unhinged. When I finally made it back to my car, I reported what I'd seen to the park rangers. I had no idea what she was doing out there, but the whole situation felt completely surreal. I've been a trail runner for over a decade. Started out doing short-day hikes back in college just to clear my head between classes. Eventually, I graduated to longerters, multi-day loops, high-elevation passes, all that good stuff. Out there, away from the noise of work, bills, phones. It's the one place I feel like I'm not pretending to have my life together. Last spring, I planned a solo trip in the 100-mile wilderness in Maine. It heads east-northeast from the town of Monson and ends outside Baxter State Park, just south of a ball bridge. I've been in the Appalachian countless times. In fact, at least 50% of all the solo trails I've ever done were in those mountains. But I'd never been to this part, the most isolated stretch of the Appalachian Trail. I was looking forward to the quiet. The trip was supposed to be 2 nights and 3 days. I parked my car near the old service road that cuts off the highway and started early around 7 o'clock a.m. The air still had a bite to it, and I could see my breath for the first half hour. I had my pack, my GPS, enough food and water, and a bare canister just in case. I didn't see another soul the first day, not even a squirrel, until mid-afternoon. The trail was rough, poorly maintained, which I liked. It forces you to stay alert, and I enjoy the challenge. Around 4:30, I made camp in a small clearing beside an old dried-up creek bed. Perfect spot. I set up my tent, boiled water for dinner, and jotted a few notes in my trail log. I was out cold by 9 p.m. The woods were dead quiet. Too quiet, honestly. Usually there's a soundscape. Bugs, owls, wind, but that night felt off. Still, I chalked it up to the cold snap. Animals probably hunkered down. I know it's the biggest cliche in the book, but maybe there's a reason so many people experience this kind of silence in the forest before something bad happens. Still, despite that feeling, the night passed uneventfully. It was only the second day when things started to feel truly wrong. I broke camp early and got back on the trail heading south. About a mile in, I noticed bootprints that hadn't been there the day before. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone had come in from a different access point. But these weren't fresh. They'd been made recently, but not within the last hour or two. What caught my eye was the direction. The prints weren't headed in or out. They zigzagged like someone had wandered off trail, then circled back. A pattern that didn't make sense. It looked like they were made by someone who was either lost and scared or completely drunk. Then I found the candy wrapper. Bright red. One of those generic gas station brand chocolates. What made it weird wasn't just the trash. It was that it was perfectly folded. Not torn, not crumpled, just folded, clean and neat, like someone had taken their time with it. I picked it up, shoved it into my trash bag, and kept going. I've never been the kind of person to leave garbage in the woods. Still, something about it stuck with me. A weird kind of intentionality. I saw the footprints again a little further on, and once again, they were completely erratic. Same person, same boots, but walking forward and back, circling, zigzagging. I started getting concerned. Whoever this was clearly wasn't well. Around noon, I stopped for a break and heard footsteps. Not wildlife, but actual human footsteps about 30 or 40 feet behind me up on the ridge to my left. I froze, listening hard, but the sound had already stopped. I scanned the ridge. Nothing, just trees, no movement, no color. I called out trying to see if anyone would respond, but there was nothing, just silence. I figured maybe it was another solo hiker who didn't want company. I get that, but the way the footsteps had stopped so suddenly gave me goosebumps, like whoever it was had been waiting for me to move again. On top of that, this area is genuinely isolated. Not that it's impossible to run into someone, but it's still strange. I was seriously starting to freak out, so I picked up the pace. That night, I camped earlier than planned. My legs were killing me, and I wanted enough time to set up before dark. I found a decent clearing and kept my gear close. Before bed, I walked the perimeter of the clearing with my headlamp just to make sure I wasn't being paranoid. Everything looked normal. No tracks until I got back to my tent and saw something sitting on top of my pack. Another candy wrapper. Same kind, same exact fold, clean and neat, placed right on top of my gear like a calling card. It's strange how something so simple yet so out of place can make you feel deeply unsettled. I kept the fire going, sat up with my headlamp on, and clutched the knife I always keep in my boot. The woods were quiet, but something wasn't right. I kept thinking about those boot prints, the bizarre path they'd taken. It might sound dramatic, but that wrapper had been placed there by someone I didn't know. Someone who was clearly messing with me. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard movement. Not the occasional twig snap that could be an animal, but pacing. Slow, deliberate pacing about 20 feet away, just outside the firelight. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. I just listened, and I swear to God, whoever it was, they were breathing heavy, like they were worked up. I stood up fast and yelled into the darkness that I was armed. Then it stopped. No retreating footsteps, no rustling, just dead silence. Unsurprisingly, I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear in record time and bolted. I didn't care about finishing the route. I just wanted off that trail. About halfway back to the car, I stopped to catch my breath, eat something, and took a quick look around, just out of habit. That's when I saw him, standing among the trees, with a scruffy beard and clothes that looked about a decade old. He was maybe 50 yards behind me, standing perfectly still, just watching. When he realized I'd seen him, he raised a gun. Instinctively, I positioned myself between two trees and just ran as fast as I could toward my car. No looking back, no stopping. Finally, I reached my car, slammed the door, locked it, and tore out of there. Once I calmed down enough to think clearly, I drove straight to the nearest ranger station. I told them everything, gave them trail details, times, both campsites, even showed them the wrappers I'd kept. They were polite, listened carefully, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. Said maybe I'd crossed paths with a transient or a bush hiker living off-road. Said it wasn't uncommon in that region. They took my report, promised to check the trail, but I walked out knowing nothing would come of it. A few days later, I posted about the incident on a backcountry hiking forum. I wasn't expecting much, just needed to get it off my chest. But that's when things got real. I got a private message from a woman who said she'd had a similar experience 5 years earlier. Also in that same stretch, she'd been hiking with her brother and found small folded pieces of paper near their tent, each with a child's name and birthday written on it. She said they felt watched the whole trip, and one night, her brothers saw someone crouch near a tree just staring at them. They left the next morning, never went back. Since then, 3 more people have messaged me. One guy said he found a torn baby shoe hanging from a branch. Another woman said she was followed for 2 days by someone she never saw but could hear, always just out of view. One teenager said he heard a gun being loaded in the middle of the night. It's like there's someone out there, maybe more than one, living off that trail, terrorizing people, stalking them. Who knows what else? The stories aren't identical, but they all point to the same thing. Something's not right in that part of the mountains. This happened during the summer of 2014, a time that now feels almost like another lifetime, yet remains vivid in my memory. I grew up in southern Appalachia, nestled in the western part of North Carolina, about a half-hour's drive from Asheville. These mountains aren't just a place to me. They're in my blood. They're rolling hills, deep hollows, and dense forests are part of one of the oldest landscapes on Earth, with rock formations that date back over 1 billion years. With such ancient land comes a sense of mystery, an eerie blend of the haunting and the awe-inspiring that has shaped the folklore of the region. For generations, one of the most famous local phenomena is the Brown Mountain Lights, an occurrence I've witnessed countless times from wise men's view. But as strange as they are, they've never filled me with fear or left me feeling unsettled. They simply exist, just as I do. And over the years, I suppose I've learned to accept the unknown as just another part of life in these mountains. If you respect them, they respect you back. That was always my family's motto, and I took pride in it. My girlfriend at the time was from St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. We had met during university, and that year decided it would be a great idea to take a road trip together. Initially, our plan was to head up to Canada so she could visit her family. But around the same time, my grandmother, whom I hadn't seen in almost 2 years, fell ill. The doctors assured us it was nothing serious, just a bad case of the flu. But since it had been so long since I'd last visited her, we figured it would be worth taking a detour. That way we could check in on her while also turning the journey into a proper road trip. From where we were starting, the drive to my grandmother's house was long, somewhere between 20 to 24 hours if we were to go non-stop. But of course, we had no intention of driving straight through without breaks. Instead, we mapped out multiple stops along the way to make the journey more enjoyable and less exhausting. Even though my girlfriend wasn't particularly used to the discomfort of sleeping in a van, the first leg of our trip was nothing short of incredible. She was completely in awe of the landscapes we passed, marveling at the rolling hills, the endless forests, and the changing colors of the sky as we moved through different regions. I, on the other hand, was just happy to see her reaction, knowing that I was finally able to share with her a piece of the world that meant so much to me. We made a stop in Buffalo to grab something to eat and restock on supplies, before continuing down to Pittsburgh, where we were lucky enough to catch a breathtaking sunset that painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. But it was once we crossed into West Virginia that the true sense of wilderness and isolation began to settle in. The roads stretched on endlessly, weaving through dense, shadowed forests with only the occasional small town breaking up the miles of unspoiled nature. After several hours of driving through this near, empty landscape, my girl glanced at the dashboard and pointed out that we were running low on gas. We pulled up the map to find the nearest station, which turned out to be a fairly remote spot, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. By the time we finally arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving us surrounded by thick darkness, save for the dim glow of the station's flickering overhead lights. As we pulled in, my girlfriend made a joke about how places like this were straight out of a horror story. One of those eerie roadside stops where bad things always seem to happen in movies. We both laughed, but I could tell from the way she held herself that she was a little uneasy. Wanting to reassure her, I told her to stay in the van with the doors locked while I filled up the tank. I stepped out, the warm night air thick around me as I started pumping gas, the rhythmic clicking of the pump, the only sound breaking the stillness. I was about halfway done when a voice suddenly spoke up from behind me, cutting through the quiet with an unsettling edge. "You lost, son?" The question caught me off guard, not just the words themselves, but the way they were asked. I turned around to find a woman standing there staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. She looked to be in her 50s, though something about her made her seem much older. There was something off about her presence, something creepy in the way she held herself, like she was high on something. Instead of answering her question directly, I instinctively asked if she was all right, if she needed help with anything. As I spoke, my eyes darted around, scanning for a car or any sign that she had arrived with someone. But there was nothing. The place was completely empty. I asked her again if she was okay, but she didn't respond, just kept staring at me with those two wide eyes. Something about her was deeply unsettling, sending a ripple of unease crawling up my spine. Without making it obvious, I subtly signaled to my girlfriend through the windshield, motioning for her to lock the doors. Not wanting to linger any longer than necessary, I made my way into the station and approached the guy behind the counter. casually asking if he knew the woman outside. At first, he seemed completely at ease, barely even looking up from whatever he was doing. But when he finally did glance in the direction I pointed, his entire demeanor shifted in an instant. His face hardened, his body tensed, and without saying a single word, he reached down, grabbed a Savage 110 gauge rifle, and started scanning the windows with a level of seriousness that sent my heartbeat into overdrive. I grew up around guns, so the sight of one didn't necessarily scare me, but the way he reacted did. Instinctively, I ducked a little, lowering my voice as I asked him what the hell was going on. His answer was short but chilling. He told me not to engage with her, that she was rarely ever alone, and that she was part of a group that lived deep in the mountains. He mentioned that the area had a history. People had gone missing over the years, and he was convinced that this group had something to do with it, even though the police refused to acknowledge any connection between the group and the disappearances. That was all I needed to hear. Without wasting another second, I paid for the gas, hurried back to the van, and climbed in, my pulse hammering in my ears. My girlfriend was already hunched forward in her seat, clearly trying to stay out of sight. She must have seen the guy with the rifle. I didn't stop to explain. I just started the engine and drove. She kept pressing me, practically yelling, demanding to know what was happening. Finally, I muttered that the people around here were crazy and that we needed to get as far away as possible. I thought about telling her everything, the warning, the missing people, but at that moment, I figured it would only make things worse. Besides that, these mountains are full of stories about the people who live in them. Feral people or even folklore. That doesn't mean they're all true. In fact, my tendency was to believe most of them were made up. We drove for miles until exhaustion forced me to find a place to pull over. We chose a secluded clearing off a back road somewhere. That at the time felt safe enough to rest for the night. At around 3 a.m., my girlfriend shook me awake, whispering that someone was outside the van. I sat up immediately, straining to listen. Then I heard it. Footsteps, more than one person. And not just footsteps, voices. The handle on the door rattled. Someone was trying to get in. Without thinking, I grabbed my handgun, yanked back the curtain covering the van's window, and aimed it, shouting that I wasn't afraid to use it. What I saw made my stomach drop. A group of people stood on the other side of the van. Several men with the strangest dead-eyed expressions I'd ever seen. And on the right, gripping the handle, was the woman from the gas station. Instinct took over. I aimed the gun straight at her, and I saw her take a step back. My girlfriend's grip on my arm was so tight that my whole arm was going dead. I'd been in some messed up situations before, but nothing like this. The words of the guy at the gas station were hammering in my brain. Outside, I watched them hesitate. Then, one by one, they started backing away, disappearing into the trees. By the time I turned around, my girlfriend had already jumped into the driver's seat, ready to gun it. She drove like a bat out of hell for miles before finally pulling over, shaking all over. Then I switched seats and took over the driving. I have no idea what the hell that group was doing or how they managed to find us after we had driven so far from that gas station. But I do know this. We never forgot those faces, those wide, empty eyes, and neither of us ever went back to that part of the country again. It was during the autumn of 2019 when this happened to me. I had been in Appalachia for about 6 weeks, staying near Wise County, Virginia, a place people here talk about in cautious tones. I came down to work on a restoration project for an old Methodist church, the kind of work I've been doing for 15 years as a preservation carpenter. The mountains were beautiful that time of year, all rust and gold, and I thought I'd be grateful for the quiet. The job was straightforward. The church needed its original hand-hewn beams reinforced, some rot removed, the roof stabilized. It was the kind of work that could take 2 months if done right. One rented a small house about 4 miles from the church, a 1-bedroom place owned by a woman named Dorothy who seemed relieved to have someone rent it. She didn't ask many questions about my background, just took my first month's deposit and handed me a key that felt older than I was. The house sat alone on a dirt road lined with pine trees so old and thick that even in daylight, the place felt suspended in twilight. There was no cell service. The landline Dorothy left me didn't ring once in my first week. I didn't mind. I'm a quiet person by nature, the kind who prefers the sound of wood being worked to most human conversation. But after about 10 days, I started noticing something odd about the silence, that it wasn't peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your ears like you're underwater. Natural silence, the kind you get in forests, has a texture. There are bird calls in the distance, the sound of wind through branches, the crack of deadwood falling. The silence around that house felt manufactured, like something was absorbing sound before it could fully exist. I'd be working in the evenings, sanding boards on my porch, and I'd realize I couldn't hear anything. Not a single cricket, not wind. The porch lamp would be on. Moths usually swarm those lights, but there were none. I'd sit there in the yellow light and absolute silence, waiting for something to happen. But nothing ever did. At the church, the older men who worked with me didn't want to talk much. There was this guy named Jim who'd bring his truck by to help me haul materials. And one afternoon I asked him about the quiet. He looked at me like I'd asked him something in another language. "What do you mean, quiet?" He said. "The silence," I said. "Around that house I'm renting. It's different." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Different how?" "It just feels heavy, like something's keeping everything from making noise." Jim didn't say anything else. He finished helping me unload the truck and left without another word. The next day, Dorothy came by the church to drop off some paperwork, and Jim called her over. They stood talking for about 5 minutes, and Dorothy kept glancing at me. After she left, Jim told me I should probably find somewhere else to stay. That house isn't good. He said, "People don't usually stay there long." "What's wrong with it?" I asked. "It's the quiet," he said finally. "When the quiet gets that heavy, it means something's listening." I thought he was playing some kind of Appalachian game with me, trying to spook the outsider. So I stayed. But the quiet got worse. By the 3rd week, I was noticing that the silence wasn't consistent. It would build and build, getting heavier and more oppressive, and then it would break suddenly, like something had changed. But nothing would actually happen when it broke. Just the silence returning, reset, starting to build again. I started keeping track of it in a notebook. The pattern seemed to peak around midnight and 3 in the morning. On those nights, I'd lie in bed and feel that weight pressing down on me so hard I could barely breathe. It felt like something was in the room with me, taking up space, absorbing air. One night I got up and turned on every light in the house. I walked through each room, and the silence followed me. In the kitchen, I opened every cabinet, dropped pots on the floor, turned on the radio at full volume. The noise felt thin, insubstantial, like it was being swallowed before it could fully exist. When I turned off the radio, the silence came back, but it felt different this time. It felt satisfied. I called Dorothy and told her I was leaving early, that something wasn't right with the place. She didn't argue. She just said to leave the key on the porch and she'd settle things with the church. Jim drove me to the bus station in Norton. He didn't talk the whole way, but before I got out of the truck, he said something I've never forgotten. "It's still listening," he said. "Even now that you're leaving, it'll be listening to where you go." The quiet doesn't really end for people. It just travels with them. I moved to a different state that week, but Jim was right about one thing. The quiet did follow me, not in the same physical way, but in how I experience silence now. Whenever it's too quiet anywhere I go, I feel that weight again. I feel like something's listening, and I've learned to hate the sound of my own voice because it's the only thing that keeps the silence from getting too heavy. I never went back to Wise County. I heard the church got its restoration done, but not by me. And I've never asked anyone to talk about that house, because I don't want to know what was actually in that silence with me. Some questions, I think, are safer left unanswered. It was during the autumn of 2019 when this happened to me. I had been in Appalachia for just under 3 weeks, staying near Harlan County, Kentucky, a place people here talk about in cautious tones. I'd come for work. I'm a forestry consultant, 42 years old, and I was mapping timber stands for a logging company. Straightforward job, or so I thought. The first 2 weeks were fine. I stayed in a rental cabin outside the town proper, drove out 2 different parcels each day, marked trees, took measurements, filed reports. The mountains were beautiful and that heavy, verdant way dense green interrupted by coal-scarred ridges. The locals didn't talk much when I was around, which suited me fine. I'm not particularly social anyway, but around day 15, something shifted. I noticed it when I was working a stand. About 2 miles up from the cabin, the fog rolled in earlier than it should have, thick as wool, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet. I'd seen mountain fog before. I'm from Colorado, and I've worked all over, but this felt different. Heavier, not just moisture but something with weight to it. Something that pressed against your skin and made breathing feel deliberate. I finished my work and headed back, trusting the GPS on my phone. The trees were barely visible through the murk. I kept my flashlight pointed down at my feet, watching for roots and rocks. That's when I heard it. Not with my ears exactly, but with something deeper. A sound that lived in my chest instead of traveling through the air. Low, rhythmic, not quite a heartbeat, but close. Not quite a pulse through the earth, but similar. I stopped walking. The sound continued. I turned off my flashlight, thinking maybe it was some kind of vibration from machinery in the distance, and stillness might help me locate it. But in the darkness, the sound grew louder, or closer. I still can't decide which. I turned the light back on and walked faster. The fog seemed to shift around me like it was alive, like it was actively pressing in. My chest felt tight. I told myself it was anxiety, exhaustion from the week, the altitude doing something to my breathing. But I knew better. Something was wrong. When I got back to the cabin, I sat on the porch for an hour, just breathing, watching the fog curl around the trees like it was searching for something. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, listening to that same sound, that deep thrumming that seemed to come from the mountain itself. The next morning, the fog was gone. Blue sky, crystalline light. I felt foolish for being afraid. I went out to the same stand, told myself I'd imagined everything, but I also stayed on the main path, closer to the cabin. I worked methodically, trying not to think about the previous afternoon. That evening, I drove into town for supplies. The grocery store was small, staffed by a woman in her 60s with tired eyes. I picked up coffee, some protein bars, bottled water. At the register, she looked at me with that expression I couldn't read. "You working up in Laurel Fork?" she asked. "That area, yeah. For the timber survey." She nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she already suspected. "You be careful up there in the fog," she said. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. "Why is there something dangerous?" She bagged my items carefully, each one deliberate. "Fog's not always just fog," she said finally. "Some people say it comes down from the ridge when it wants something. My grandmother used to say it brings the weight of the mountain with it. That's just stories, though." I left without asking what kind of weight she meant. That night, the fog came back. I watched it roll down the hillside like something alive, like it was hunting. I kept all the lights on inside the cabin, doors locked, and I sat in the center of the living room with my phone and laptop working, refusing to look outside. But I could hear it, that same deep sound, that thrumming in the center of my chest. It seemed to come from all directions at once, like the fog itself was producing it, like it was the fog's heartbeat. Round 2 in the morning, I heard something else, scratching, slow, deliberate scratching on the roof of the cabin. Not an animal sound, too measured, too intentional. It traced a pattern across the metal, long and deliberate, like fingernails drawn slowly across a surface. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, which I knew was stupid even as I was doing it. The fog had settled so thick I could barely see. 5 feet. The scratching had stopped, but the thrumming sound was louder now, more present, like it was inside my skull. I shone the light up at the roof, at the sides of the cabin. Nothing. No branches that could have scratched. No marks. I stood there in the fog for maybe 30 seconds, just long enough to notice that the sound seemed to sync with my heartbeat, that they were becoming the same rhythm. Then I went back inside and locked every door and window. I sat up for the rest of the night, and when dawn came, I packed my truck and drove out of Harlan County without finishing the survey. The company wasn't happy, but I didn't care. I couldn't explain it to them. I still can't explain it now. What I do know is this: 3 days after I left, another timber consultant was hired to finish the job. According to the company, he only lasted 1 day. He made it as far as the Laurel Fork stand before he came back to his truck and drove away. He never gave a reason, just said the job wasn't for him. The company had to bring in someone from out of state, someone who'd never heard the local stories, who couldn't hear whatever I heard. I've never gone back to Harlan County, and I never work in fog anymore, because sometimes, late at night, I still feel that thrumming in my chest, and I wonder if it ever left me at all, or if I'm still carrying it, still sense to something's heartbeat, something that lives in the weight of Appalachian fog and wants something from people like me, who don't understand the mountains well enough to listen. Back in the spring of 2018, I found myself spending some time in Appalachia. I was staying near Trouble Creek, Kentucky, and I had no idea how strange that week would become. My name is Gerald, I'm 63, and I'd come down to help my brother Mike sort through our family's old property. We'd inherited a farm from our aunt, and neither of us had been back to that part of Kentucky in over 30 years. The property sat at the end of a long gravel drive, surrounded by thick forest on 3 sides. Our aunt had raised horses there, and there were still a few buildings standing: the farmhouse, a barn, some outbuildings that were mostly collapsed. The main house was smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling to gray wood, but it was still standing. Mike only stayed a few days. He had a job back in Louisville he couldn't leave, so he helped me assess what we needed to do, then drove back. I decided to stay for a couple of weeks to catalog what was inside and figure out if anything was worth keeping. Most of it looked like it should be thrown away, but I wanted to do the work properly. By my second night alone, I started noticing I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I'm too old for that. It was a physical sensation, the kind you feel when someone's looking at you across a room. I'd be inside cataloging furniture, and I'd look out the window and see movement in the tree line. When I looked directly at it, nothing was there, but the moment I turned away, I'd feel it again. On the 3rd day, I found something that unsettled me more than any feeling could. Behind the barn, carved into the largest oak tree, was a face. Not a face carved by someone with artistic skill. It was crude, gouged directly into the bark with something sharp. 2 holes for eyes, a long gash for a mouth, and it was old. The sap had hardened and blackened around the cuts. The tree had grown over parts of it. I called Mike that night and asked if he remembered the carved tree. He was quiet for a long time. I remember Aunt saying something about it. He finally said, "But I don't want to remember what. Just leave it alone." What does that mean, leave it alone? It means don't look at it too much, and don't let it look at you. That made no sense, but I didn't push it. Mike had always been superstitious, even as a kid, but I couldn't stop thinking about that face carved in the tree. Every time I went near the barn, I could feel it, and the sensation of being watched got stronger. It wasn't frightening at first, exactly. It was more like standing in front of an audience. Uncomfortable, but not dangerous. Then I started finding things. The first was a stone with an X scratched into it, placed on the porch outside the front door. The second was a bundle of twigs tied together with what looked like human hair, hung from the kitchen window frame on a string of the same hair. The third was a pile of feathers arranged in a spiral on the barn floor. These things weren't old. They were fresh. Someone was putting them there while I slept or while I was in another part of the property. I didn't search for whoever was doing it. I gathered the objects and drove them to a ravine about 5 miles away and threw them into the water. That night, I locked every door and window, even though none of the locks worked properly. I sat on the couch with a flashlight and a kitchen knife and waited for morning. At 3 in the morning, I heard a sound on the porch. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking the length of the porch back and forth. I counted 37 passes. Then they stopped. When I finally looked out at dawn, there were no footprints in the damp earth. I packed my car that morning. I called Mike and told him I was leaving and that he needed to sell the property without me. He didn't argue. When I told him about the footsteps and the objects, he just said that someone or something had been watching that property for a very long time, and that we shouldn't have come back. Our aunt stayed there 50 years, he said. Do you know why she never left? I didn't answer, because it wouldn't let her, he said. I think she made a deal with it. I think that's the only way you stay. I haven't been back to that property since. Mike sold it 6 months later to someone from out of state. I heard through a mutual friend that the new owners abandoned it within a month. The face is probably still carved in that tree, watching the empty farmhouse and the barn, waiting for someone to come back. And I have this terrible feeling that one day I won't be able to leave. During the summer of 2017, something happened to me in Appalachia that I still struggle to explain. I was in the Grayson Highlands area for work, and it changed how I see the mountains forever. My name is Keisha, I'm 31, and I was a wildlife biologist conducting a population survey on the wild horses that roam that region. It was supposed to be straightforward field work, spend for weeks observing, cataloging, photographing the herds, noting health indicators. I'd rented a small cabin near the park boundary and planned my routes carefully. Grayson Highlands is relatively well maintained, but there are still remote areas where the forest gets dense and the trails get unclear. By the end of my second week, I noticed something wasn't right with the horse behavior. They were avoiding a particular hollow, a valley that cut deep into the mountain where a creek ran. The horses would graze on either side of it, but they refused to go down into it. When I got close to the edge, they'd move away. That made me curious. It also made me nervous, because curiosity is what gets wildlife biologists killed. I was trained to read animal behavior, and what I was seeing suggested the hollow was dangerous. But I also had a job to do, and my job was to document the entire population area. So I started my descent into the hollow on a morning when the light was good, and I had plenty of time before dark. The creek at the bottom was narrow and clean, the water moving fast over rocks. The hollow itself was beautiful in that oppressive Appalachian way, with moss on every surface and trees so old they looked petrified. The air was thick, and it smelled like rotten earth, like something was decomposing all around me. I followed the creek upstream, taking photographs and notes. The temperature dropped as I moved deeper, and the light got worse because the canopy was so thick. I was starting to think about turning back when I found the first animal. It was a deer, lying on its side in the creek, partially submerged. Its legs were twisted at angles that suggested violence, but there were no wounds on its body that I could see. Its eyes were open, staring up at me. The body wasn't fresh, it had been there for days. I moved around it and kept going upstream. That's when I started finding more. A fox, antlers from what looked like a moose or elk, which shouldn't even be in that region. A beaver, multiple birds, all of them positioned carefully in or beside the creek. All of them arranged like they'd been placed. There was something deliberate about how they were positioned. It felt like an arrangement, a display. And with each new animal, I felt more unsettled. I should have left then. I knew I should have, but I wanted to understand what I was seeing. The hollow opened up about 200 yards further upstream, and what I found in that open space stopped me cold. It wasn't just dead animals. It was a collection. Bones arranged in patterns on the ground, some recent, some yellowed with age. Skulls positioned to look at each other. Vertebrae arranged in spirals. And in the center of it all, something that looked like it had been built intentionally. It was a structure made of bones, roughly 8 feet tall, shaped almost like a totem. It had taken someone an enormous amount of time and effort to construct. The bones were lashed together with strips of hide that had dried and hardened. At the very top, nested into the structure like a crown, was a human skull. I couldn't breathe. My entire body went cold, and I stood there staring at that thing for I don't know how long. Then I heard something behind me, a sound like breathing, or like something moving through the brush. I turned, and there was nothing there, but the feeling of presence was overwhelming. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back, just ran upstream toward where I'd come from. My equipment bouncing against my body, my heart in my throat. I don't remember climbing out of the hollow. but I made it back to the forest and didn't stop running until I reached my cabin. I reported it to the park rangers immediately. I told them what I'd found, showed them my photographs. They looked at the images and then looked at each other in a way that told me they weren't surprised. People disappear in those hollows sometimes, one ranger said quietly. We find what we find, and we put signs up, and folks still go down there. I asked him what was down there. He wouldn't answer directly, but he said the hollow had been collecting things for a very long time, and some places in the mountains had purposes that humans shouldn't interfere with. I left Grayson Highlands that day. I've never published the survey results because I don't know how to explain what I found. I've tried to move on, but sometimes I think about that skull positioned at the top of that bone structure, and I wonder who it belonged to, and how long ago someone placed it there, and whether anyone's placed something new in that hollow since I left. In the autumn of 2020, I was living near to Zewell, Tennessee, in the foothills of the Cumberland Mountains. I thought I understood these mountains, but an incident during that time proved me wrong. My name is Vincent, I'm 55, and I'd moved to Tennessee to escape a city job and try small-scale farming. I'd bought 3 acres with an old cabin on it, and I was learning to work the land. The property bordered a large stretch of state forest, which I thought was ideal. Privacy, space, access to trails. My neighbors were sparse, which suited me fine. I was there to get away from people. On my 3rd week on the property, I decided to explore the forest trail that ran along my back boundary. It looked well maintained, the kind of trail that would loop back to my property or connect to other established paths. I brought water and my phone and set out in the early afternoon. The trail was beautiful and peaceful. It wound through oak and hickory, crossed a creek on a wooden bridge that someone had maintained, climbed gently upward. I walked for what felt like 40 minutes, checking my phone occasionally to see my progress. The GPS showed I was moving in a steady northeast direction. Then I noticed something odd. The trail markers were repeating. I'd seen a particular arrangement of blazes to white marks stacked vertically. About 15 minutes into the walk, I should not have seen them again, but there they were, on a tree to my left, looking identical, at what my phone insisted was a completely different location. I told myself I was confused, that I'd misremembered. I kept walking. 5 minutes later, I came to the wooden creek bridge again. Same bridge, same creek, in what my GPS insisted was a completely different part of the forest. I stopped. I turned around and walked backward on the trail, retracing my steps, paying close attention to landmarks. The trail behind me looked nothing like the trail ahead of me, but when I turned back around and continued forward, the scenery repeated itself exactly. It took me 3 hours to realize that I wasn't actually going anywhere. The forest was cycling. Every segment of trail repeated perfectly, every landmark, every tree marker. My GPS insisted I was making progress, but I was walking in place. No matter which direction I chose at unmarked intersections, the result was the same dot by sunset. I was angry and scared. I stopped trying to follow the GPS and just picked the direction that felt like it would take me back toward my property. I walked for another hour until I broke through the tree line and found myself in my own backyard. My cabin was visible through the trees. I didn't go back to that forest for 3 days. I told myself I'd gotten confused, that I'd made a mistake about the trail layout. But on the 4th day, I tried again, and the same thing happened. Every trail that entered the forest looped back on itself. No matter how I tried to navigate through it, I ended up back at my property. On the evening of the 4th day, an old man appeared on my property. I was sitting on my porch, and he was just there, walking through my front yard like he lived there. He was thin and weathered, in his 80s maybe, and he moved slowly but deliberately. "You've been trying the forest trails," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "They're not mapping right. I keep circling." "You're not circling," he said. "The forest is circular. Everything folds back. That land has been like that for a long time. Some places don't want to be entered. They just want you to know they're there." "What do you mean, doesn't want to be entered?" "You own your land, but you don't own the forest," he said. "That forest owns itself. It belonged to the people before, and then to the people before that, back further than anyone remembers. It doesn't open for outsiders. It only lets you come back to what you know. I never found out who he was or how he got on my property. He turned and walked back into the forest, and I didn't see him again. But I've learned to respect the boundaries. I never try to go deep into that forest anymore. I stick to the edges, to the places where it lets me be. Sometimes I hear sounds from the forest at night, sounds that don't match any animal I know. And I've convinced myself that the man was right. That forest is a closed thing, and it doesn't want visitors. It just marks its boundaries and waits for people like me to understand and accept them. I spent the winter of 2016 in Appalachia, staying close to Whitesburg, Kentucky. What happened during that stay still follows me in ways I can't fully describe. My name is Anna. I'm 44, and I'd come to the region to work on a documentary project about mountain communities and traditional crafts. I was staying in a rented cottage and planning to conduct interviews over the course of 3 months. The cottage was comfortable and isolated, sitting on about 5 acres of land with forest on all sides. I didn't have close neighbors, which was ideal for my work. I could record interviews without ambient noise, and I had space to set up my equipment. By my second week, I started hearing the hollow dot. It wasn't music exactly. It was more like wind through a pipe, a sustained note that seemed to come from somewhere in the forest beyond my property. It was almost musical, with variations in pitch, but the underlying tone was constant and slightly painful to listen to. It would start in the late afternoon and continue through the evening. I recorded it the first night, thinking I could identify the source or use it as ambient sound for my documentary. When I played back the recording, my blood ran cold. On the tape, the sound was different. It sounded like voices, multiple voices singing in a language I didn't recognize, layered over the wind-like tone. But I hadn't heard voices when I recorded it. I'd only heard the wind-like sound. The next night, I set up multiple recording devices at different positions on my property and in the surrounding forest. I wanted to triangulate the source. I recorded for 2 hours, then gathered the equipment and went inside. When I played the recordings back, each one told a different story. The device closest to the forest recorded clear voices, singing and sometimes whispering. The device in my backyard recorded something that sounded like multiple people walking through brush. The device inside my cottage recorded something that sounded like knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from inside the walls. I called the property manager and asked if there was something in the forest, a settlement or a music school or something that might explain the sounds. She said there wasn't, that the land behind me was state forest and undeveloped. But people do hear things out there, she said, almost reluctantly. I heard them when I used to stay there. Most people don't stay past January. What kind of things? Singing, she said. Like there's a party happening in the woods that you can't quite find. I told her I'd heard the same thing. She told me not to follow the sound, that the woods played tricks with acoustics, and people could get lost easily. When I pressed her about what was actually making the noise, she hung up. That night, the sound changed. It became clearer, more distinct, and almost like it was calling. The voices seemed to be saying something, though I couldn't quite make out words. There was a pattern to it, like a question being asked over and over. And when I didn't answer, the volume increased. I left my cottage at midnight and drove to a hotel in town. I told the manager I had equipment problems and needed to relocate temporarily. I spent a week in the hotel, working on editing my interviews and trying to convince myself that I'd misunderstood what I heard. When I went back to the cottage, the sound was waiting, louder now, more insistent. And this time, there were objects on my porch, items I recognized from my interview sessions: a quilting pattern, a wood carving, a woven basket, objects from people I'd talked to, but they weren't items I'd brought home. I packed my car in a panic. As I was leaving, I saw someone standing at the edge of my property, watching me. I couldn't see their face, couldn't make out any details, but I could feel them watching me drive away. I didn't go back to finish my documentary. I told people the project fell through for financial reasons, but the truth is, I got too close to something and it noticed me. And now, years later, Whenever I record interviews or listen to people singing, I can still hear that hollow underneath, that wailing, calling, asking its question over and over. I never found out what was making that sound. And I've learned that some things in the mountains don't want to be recorded or understood. They just want to be heard. Back in the summer of 2019, I was staying in a small place near Asheville, North Carolina, in the foothills of the Blue Ridge. I had been there only a few days when things started to feel strange. My name is Patricia. I'm 62, and I'd rented a house for the summer to work on painting. I'm an artist, and I'd come for the quiet and the light and the isolation. The house was old and beautiful, set back from the road, surrounded by rhododendron and mountain laurel. There was a studio space where I could set up canvases and work. I spent my first few days settling in and exploring the nearby trails. On the evening of my third day, I heard singing. It was beautiful, a woman's voice, almost operatic, singing something I didn't recognize. The melody was haunting and sad, and it seemed to come from somewhere in the forest near the house. I listened for a while, charmed by it, and then went inside. The singing continued through the night, on and off, sometimes close to the house, sometimes distant. I found it soothing rather than disturbing, the kind of unexpected gift that can make a place feel magical. In the morning, I asked the property manager about it, whether there was a music student or singer nearby. She said she didn't know of anyone, that I was probably hearing wildlife or wind, though she admitted it was unusual. She also seemed uncomfortable with the question, changing the subject quickly. I didn't think much of it. I set up my studio and began working on a series of paintings I'd been planning. I was so absorbed in the work that I lost track of time easily. The singing continued every evening. After a week, I realized it was always the same song, the same melody, repeated over and over with slight variations. It had an emotional quality that affected me deeply, and I found myself wanting to paint it, to capture the feeling of it in color and form. By my second week, I realized something else. The singing was getting closer to the house each night, and on the night of the 15th day, I understood why. I woke at 3 in the morning to the sensation of being watched. I got up and went to the window, and I saw her, a woman in the laurel bushes near the house, illuminated by moonlight. She was thin, wearing what looked like an old white dress, and she was singing. Her mouth was open, her voice clear and beautiful, and she was staring directly at my window. I stepped back from the glass immediately. My heart was racing, but I made myself look again. She was still there, still singing, still staring. I called the property manager in the morning and told her someone was trespassing on the property, that there was a woman in the bushes. She told me to call the police. When I described the woman, there was a long silence on the line. What did she look like? The manager asked finally, thin, pale, wearing a white dress. She was singing. The manager didn't say anything for a long moment. Did she look solid? Did she look like a regular person? That question made me understand something I didn't want to understand. I told the manager I was leaving that day. She didn't try to convince me to stay. I packed my belongings and left. As I was putting my suitcase in the car, I heard the singing one more time, and it sounded like it was saying goodbye, or like it was promising that I hadn't actually escaped. It's been 5 years. I've moved 3 times since then, and every summer, when the rhododendrons bloom and the laurel fills the mountains, I start hearing that same melody. And every time, it feels like she's a little bit closer than the year before, like she's been following the sound of me through the world, waiting for me to stop moving. It was the spring of 2021, and I had traveled to the Appalachian region for a short break. My cabin near Letcher County, Kentucky felt peaceful at first. My name is David, I'm 51, and I'm a teacher. I'd come to the mountains for a week of hiking and solitude, wanting to clear my head before the end of the school year. The cabin was small, comfortable, situated on a steep hillside overlooking a valley. I spent my first few days exploring local trails, taking photographs, and generally decompressing. The spring weather was perfect, cool mornings warming into pleasant afternoons. On my 4th day, I noticed the first mark. It was scratched into a tree about 100 yards from the cabin. a symbol that looked like 3 vertical lines with a circle around them. It was fresh, the exposed wood still pale. I thought maybe some other hiker had made it, marked their route. The next day, I found another one, deeper in the forest. Same symbol, same appearance, and also fresh dot by the end of my first week. I'd found 17 of them, all on trees surrounding my cabin, all the same symbol, all fresh, and they seemed to be getting closer to the cabin with each day. The first ones had been far out in the forest, but by day 6, I found one scratched into the wooden railing of my cabin porch. I took a photograph of it and sent it to a friend who was interested in local history and hiking. He called me back within an hour, sounding concerned. "Where did you see that?" he asked. "It's on my cabin. I've been finding them all around here. Don't make any more marks near it," he said. "Don't respond to it. Just leave it alone and get out if you can." "What is it?" I asked. "It's a boundary marker," he said. "It's not contemporary. People in that region have been using that symbol to mark off areas that shouldn't be entered or disturbed. I've seen them in photographs of old property lines going back 100 years or more. But it's fresh. These are new marks, I know," he said quietly. "That's the part that worries me." I left the cabin the next day. But before I did, I found marks on my car. The same symbol, scratched into the hood and the driver's side door. The marks so fresh the paint was still wet underneath. I drove down the mountain in a state of real panic. I kept checking my rearview mirror, convinced I was being followed. When I got back to the city, I called the cabin's manager and told him I needed to leave immediately, that I wasn't paying for the remaining days. He didn't argue. He just asked if I'd disturbed anything at the property, if I'd gone where I shouldn't have gone. I told him I'd just hiked local trails. He said that was good, that I should probably not come back to that area. It's been 3 years since I left that cabin, but the marks didn't stop. I've started finding them on things I own, scratched into my car despite no one having access to it, marked onto boxes in my locked garage, carved into a piece of wood in my shed. Always the same symbol, always fresh, like someone is maintaining them. I've learned not to leave them alone and wait for them to go away. I don't know what offended someone, what boundary I crossed, but something in those mountains is keeping track of me, keeping track of the marks, maintaining a claim. And I have the terrible sense that whoever is making them is patient, and that eventually, they'll expect me to come back.